In this tutorial, Amanda and I are going to show you how to sew the jump set, and we're going to focus on the areas that we feel are a little bit tricky and you may need a bit more support. So to start, you will sew the yoke of the front bodice, and it can look a little bit confusing when you first get started, so we would highly suggest that you lay your pattern pieces out with the wrong side facing up. So this is the top front, which is A, and you can tell that they are placed correctly because that's essentially the wrap. And then this is B, which is the front sleeve. So that is your shoulder seam there, and that is your sleeve there. So once you've got your notches clearly marked, you can see how they will start to align. So essentially, you have 3 notches on this side, and you have another 3 notches here. So these 3 notches align with these 3 notches, not this notch. So that is just a seam allowance notch, so it's not part of this section. And then you have 1 notch here and 1 notch here, so those will align. And then these are seam allowance notches. So it will really help you to make sure that your notches are very clearly marked and you have placed both sides open like this. We're going to work on one side at a time, and what we've done is we've prepped this area to show you the journey of how we're going to take you through making this. Essentially what we've done is we've marked the seam allowances. We're just using a friction pen which comes off when you press. So we have marked and we've crossed over where the seam allowance is, which is 1.5 centimeters, and that is our little pivot point there. On this piece, again, we've marked the seam allowances, and where they've crossed is our pivot point. So essentially what will happen is the 2 pivot points will join together like that. So to make sure that you are able to see this when it's under the sewing machine, we've actually drawn the clear lines, and we've put a piece of interfacing on here, which is 2 centimeters square. So in the instruction book, we tell you to cut a 1.5 square of interfacing, but we've actually made it a little bit bigger, which will be more helpful for you when you're sewing it. So this is a 2.5 centimeter square. And what we've done is we've run a stitch. We've used a blue thread just to show you, but we've run a stitch on the inside of the 1.5 centimeter line. So this will act as a reinforcing stitch, because what will happen is we're going to cut up in parallel into this line here, and those stitches will help to reinforce the fabric. So in the next step, we will break that all down step by step so you can see how to do it. All right, so I've got the front sleeve B with the right side facing up, and I still can see my notches clearly. So I'm taking my 2.5 centimeter piece of interfacing and I'm going to place it down, but just make sure you are gluing that the glue side is facing down onto the fabric like that. So I'm going to press that piece of interfacing.
But just make sure that if you have used a Friction iron-on pen, that you're not ironing out your notches.
Great tip, Amanda. So I can still see my notches quite clearly, but that's a really good point. You don't want to lose your notches at this point. So what we're going to do now is we are going to use a fabric marker and a ruler. So in this case, I am using a Friction pen, and I'm just going to measure 1.5 across from the raw edge. Note that this has a slight curve, so you want to make some good measurements here to make sure you're able to draw that seam allowance. I'm going to draw there, then I'm going to meet those 2 up, and I'm actually just going to go a little higher like that. Then when I come to this side, I'm going to do that, 1.5 and 1.5, and now this time those lines will intersect there. So what's happened is it's given you a very clear pivot point when you're sewing the yoke, because this will be sewn in one step. You'll sew from this edge to this point and pivot, and then you'll sew down, and on the other side you'll sew the opposite. So that pivot point is really important. So in the next step, we will move on to stitching a stabilizing stitch, and the stabilizing stitch should be just on the inside of that drawn line there. We don't want it to be perfectly on the 1.5. So you don't need to use the seam allowance guides on your sewing machine now. You just need to run a stitch just on the inside of that drawn line there. And then you will keep your needle in and you will pivot to come across to there. So we'll show you the step on the sewing machine next.
So we're now going to create the stitching line that Lisa showed you in the last video. And so I'm lowering my needle down and you're running the stitch line. It's going to be on the inside edge of that line. And so we don't need to go forwards and backwards because it's just a holding stitch.
We've got the stitch length on 3, so you don't want the stitch length to be too long. So 3 is like a medium stitch length.
So as you come to the corner, you're going to pivot and lift your needle foot up and then pivot round, lower, and then you're on the inside edge.
Now that you've stitched your reinforcing stitch on both sides of the front sleeve B, we're going to snip into this corner here, and you're going to snip up to, but not too close to those stitches there. So I've just drawn the cutting line. You're very welcome to do that. And I'm going to cut just up to that point there. So the next step would be to place some pins where your notches are. So I've got, and I actually at this point, I like to double pin. So I'll put my pins in like that so that they don't fall out. So I'm going to put another pin in here. So I've used the same color for these 3 notches. Obviously don't double pin if your fabric is really thin or fragile. We don't want the pins to cause any damage to the fabric. And then I'm going to use the yellow pin for this notch here. So we'll use the same color pins on the top front A with the 3 notches and the 1 so that they can help you to marry the pieces up together. So this piece is now prepared. This is the front sleeve B, so that is ready for sewing. And what we'll do is we'll bring the top front A back into view. And what we've done is we have also drawn, although this is not in the instruction book, this is really going to help you as an extra tip. So we've also drawn the 1.5 centimeter seam allowance in both of those corners, and we're showing you where to pivot. So again, you will place your pins. There's my notch, my 1 notch. I'll just put 1 pin in there, and then I've got my 3. Pins. Oh, that one's orange on both sides. So I'll just use this red one. Okay, doke. So you don't cut into this corner. This is all you're doing here is you're drawing, you're not sewing, you're just drawing your stitching lines, which are 1.5 from the raw edge. So once those pieces are all prepared, we'll move into the sewing part in the next step. So in this step, we just want to explain how the yoke will be sewn. And to make it a little bit easier to explain, we've also stitched on the on A. So we've created a row of stitching within the seam allowance there. So you don't need to do that. This is just for us to explain it. This is the side where that we have stitched, and there's our area that we've snipped into. So I've got both sides, right side facing up. There's my 3 pins on this side, and that is on B. And there's my 3 pins on A. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip B over like that, and you can see that your 3 pins now align. but we would suggest breaking this down into a couple of steps. So what we're going to do is we're only going to sew this little yoke section here. Then we can check it from the right side, make sure we're happy with it, and then it will be super easy to just sew and complete the other two sections. So to illustrate what we are doing is these two pins will align. So you can pin the two fabrics and make sure that your raw edges are aligned. But when I place a pin through the pivot point here and I look underneath, can you see how beautifully that lines up there? And do you remember you drew the guides underneath? So if I just turn that over, your pin is exiting perfectly on that pivot point, okay? So again, like I was saying, is you don't need these stitches here because you actually have the reference underneath that you can check that it's all pinned perfectly together. So what will happen is you will stitch from this pin to the pivot point, and then you will keep the needle in and you will bring this round on the machine, and this whole section will pivot round, and those two raw edges will align there like that. So we've actually stitched the other side so that you can see how it looks once it's sewn, but just for this step we just wanted to explain how these two align with each other. So we have completed the opposite side so that before you sew the yoke, you can see what it looks like finished. So this is the completed yoke, and that's the point where we pivoted. You can see how beautifully that all matches up. So I'm just going to turn that over so you can see what it looks like from the inside. So if I flip that over like that, that's what it looks like from the inside. Now you'll notice that these raw edges are not overlocked, and that is specifically so that you can overlock them together at a later step, which will be instructed in the instruction book. But what we would have done on this side is we would have started here. We would have started there, and we would have pivoted round to there. So you can see sometimes you might get a little bit of excess fabric here. When we're at the sewing machine, we'll give you some tips on how not to catch fabric in there. And you can see how beautifully that's opened up there. And those reinforcement stitches is giving you some really nice reinforcement there. So I'll just bring that round again so that it looks like that. Once this has been completed, you would press those seams. And I would also suggest as you're pressing just to pull that up a little bit like that so you don't get a double fold underneath. So those seams would get pressed up and these seams would get pressed across. And then you would go and you would overlock these raw edges across there, take it out, and then you would overlock all the way down to the bottom of the hem.
Or if you haven't got an overlocker, you would zigzag stitch.
Yes. Good point, Amanda. So now we will take you to the sewing machine and we're going to show you exactly how to sew the yoke.
So as Lisa explained in the last video, we're now going to machine this right angle here on your sleeve. And just to go over again where you're pinning through, and I've got the pin going through the Friction marker on the inside, you can see on the outside, sorry, of the machining line. And if I just fold that back, you can see the pin. It is just, if I maneuver that there, it's on the inside edge there. All right, so I'm going to then pin that, and then these two notches here with the pins, if you feel that it's not quite marrying up, you can just ease that fabric, because all fabrics are going to be slightly different, and then pop the pin in and take the second pin out. So we're now going to making sure that those two edges are together, and we're going to take this to the machine, and it is a length of stitch 3. And I'm placing my foot down, but I'm going to be machining to the left hand side of that machining that we did earlier. So I'm going to lower my needle And then we're going to machine. We're not doing a locking stitch. As you come up to the corner, you can ease your foot off the pedal, and then you're using the dial because you have got more control. And as I come down, and I'm just going to nudge it a little bit and leave my needle in that pivoting position, because then you're going to take your pin out and then you're going to lift your foot up. Now, making sure as you maneuver this fabric round, if I leave it like that, you can see, and you're then going to maneuver the top layer around, because we need to marry up this yellow pin with this yellow pin. And then there, so I'm doing it slowly so you can see, and you're bringing this over, and kind of it naturally wants to kind of fold there, and you're then marrying up the two edges there, and the two yellow pins will eventually go together, but we're only machining a small area to help you do this corner nicely. So you want to see, again, can you see I'm maneuvering it with my dial rather than my foot pedal at this precise moment, and you are machining as close as you can go to that machining line that you did there. So I do a few more stitches and then I'm going to take it out of the sewing machine to show you there, and then if I fold that back, you can see that's your corner.
And so now if you're happy with your corner, you'll then go in and sew the other two sides meeting up to those stitching lines, which we'll show you in the next step. So if you are happy with your yoke seam, you can just go to the right side and check it. That looks amazing. And then what you'll do is you'll come back and just complete that edge, and then you'll go in and complete that edge. And now you can see, now that the yoke is stitched, we can overlock the raw edges, which we've done on this side, so that you can see. So we've overlocked from there to there, and then we've turned it around and we've overlocked from there to there. And what's really lovely about this, I'll just show you from the right side. I would first press, on the wrong side, I would press the seams up towards the sleeve, and just make sure that, like we mentioned before, that you're not getting a double seam there. So as you're pressing, just pull that little bit of fabric out like that. You can then turn it to the right side, and if you would like to, you can create a top stitch running along that seam there and pivoting down to there. So that looks really lovely in a red or a cream on this denim. So once that is all overlocked and pressed, you are ready to move on to the next stage. So the next stage that you would be at when you come back to the video tutorial is to sew the facing in. So you would have already completed the steps up to that point. So in this tutorial, we are making the dress version, and what you would normally have with the dress version is that you would have stitched the center back all the way up to this point. So the center back will be completely closed and you would have pressed the center back open. But what we're going to do is we're just going to sidestep, and we're going to show you how to, if you were making the jump set, we're going to show you how to sew the little tie in the back before you put the facing in. So if you're making the dress version, you can continue to watch this, or you can skip ahead to the point where the tie has been completed. So if you're making the jump set version, we need to sew a little loop in the center back that will then close around a button, and that will enable you to then open it and pop it on, and then close the center back with a little loop and button. So you have a couple of options. You can make your button loop with the same fabric that you're using, and the instructions are in the instruction book that show you how to create your loop. If you're finding that the fabric is too bulky, you can use any ribbon. So ultimately your ribbon will be folded in half and it will slide over your button to close the center back. So although we've completed this section, we're going to show you how to do that. So with the center back fabric facing up, we're just going to fold this side away. So we're going to work on the left hand side fabric. And what we're going to do is, you would have taken your ribbon and you would have folded in half like that. And then you'll take your button and you'll slide the ribbon over it. And you want the ribbon to be quite firmly tight around the button. So you want to know where that point is, because I'm going to take the button out and I'm going to place that ribbon so that it's on the stitching line of the center back, which is 1.5. And when you press the center back seam allowances open, you would have continued to press up the center back, and that will give you a lovely crease line which will help you to guide the ribbon and where to place it. So in the instructions we say that you can stitch this ribbon. You still want to place it there, but you could stitch it on that center back line or a little bit further. It doesn't matter, because it will get stitched into the facing. So what we've done here is we've stitched it on the center back line, and we're just going to double check that when we put the button through there, it slides through beautifully. So once that is stitched and you turn it over like that, that's how your center back will look completed. But we still need to sew the facing in, and I'll just show you quickly that once you sew the facing in, your stitching line here is 1.5, so it catches the ribbon or your tie underneath, and when that is completed, it will look like that. So you can continue to sew your ribbon in now, and then what we'll do is we'll carry on in the next step, showing you how to sew the facing in. So we are at the point now where we're going to attach the facing to the bodice, and we're going to show you how to complete the back, whether you are doing the jump set or the dress version. So what you need to do is find the notch on the front facing. So there's your shoulder seam and there's a notch on the front facing. So I'm just going to put a pin in there, and what that does is it matches up to the seam of the yoke. So just make sure that your seam is still facing up and it doesn't create a little double fold there. So you want it to be nice and flush there, and you're going to pop the notch directly over that seam. So we put our pins in horizontally, which allows the fabric to move instead of putting them in like that, which kind of stops the fabric from having any give and movement. So we would suggest putting your pins in like this when you pin the facing. So we have pinned the notch, and then we will come to pin the shoulder seam. So I'd first pin the shoulder seam, making sure that those seam allowances are open. So there we go. I'm going to slide a pin in there, and again you can just double check if you want to that those match up underneath. So I'm going to just replace that pin and place it in that way. And then can you see I've got a little bit of easing here in between. It's not a lot, and I can actually just ease it in with my fingers. So I'm just going to pop a pin in there to hold those fabrics. And you want to make sure that the raw edges of the fabrics are flush and aligned with each other. That just eases in itself, which will we can do at the sewing machine. Then I'm going to come down to the hem, and I'm going to pin the hems together. And then I'm going to work on this section between this pin and the hem. So I can see that it is fitting in beautifully. If you needed to ease it in a little bit, you can do that without stretching the fabric. So I'll place a few more pins to hold that in place. Okay, so I'm very happy with that section. That is ready to be stitched. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come around to the center back. So just to refer to the dress version, if this was the dress version, your center back would be stitched closed and the seam allowances would be open like that. So the difference between the jump set and the dress is that on the jump set, the center back is open, and on the dress version, it's on the fold, so your center back is already closed on the facing piece. So what we'll do here is we will come to the center back. Now just make sure that instead of pinning it like that, you actually open up the center back, and those raw edges along the neckline and the center back are flush with each other. So if I look at the facing underneath, when you sew around the neckline, you will actually pivot and you will sew just to where the end of the facing is. So you stitch, that's how you sew that closed. And this is 1.5 and this is 1 centimeter along the neckline. So make sure everything is pinned in place and those raw edges are flush. So if this was the dress version, you would just continue to pin all the way around. Now what you'll do is you'll go over to the other side and you will repeat that process, pinning the shoulder seams, the notch to the yoke seam and down to the hem. And then once that's all pinned in, the next step is we'll show you how to sew this on the sewing machine.
So now we're on the opposite side, so we're going to start from the neck, centre back, right, and then we're going down to the bottom. Okay, so we're going to pop that underneath again, and then we're going to, and again I've put some markers there so you can see, because we're 1.5 centimeters, and then we're going into a 1 centimeter seam allowance on the neck facing. So take your pins out, and then you're coming up to pivot on that corner there, leave your needle in, pivot and around. If you're working with softer fabric, it can quite easily get caught underneath, so always check what you're doing. So again, can you see this is opened up again? It's very easy. That's your shoulder seam. So we're going to open those out and maneuver around that corner there. So I'm going to use my function on my machine where every time I stop, the needle stays in the down position, but it doesn't matter if you haven't got that. You just have to maneuver the wheel yourself. So there we are. So as we come down to this, because we're on the opposite side, this is where this seam is going upwards towards the shoulder. So you've got to make sure that that doesn't automatically flick down. So that's going up, it's going in the opposite direction that we're sewing. So then you've just got to check that before you machine over the top. And again, if you have got some ease, you need to hold at the back and at the front and just slowly maneuver that fabric underneath the machine. You can see on the pattern you would have had your little notches there. You can see I've got a white one there, which I knew my seam allowance, so I know where I'm going to stop there. A locking stitch, and that's finished. So this is where you would just double check that you have got your 2 seams running along where your center back and where your next seam is, and then we're just going to clip into the the curved edge. You don't need to go all the way down to on the straight. It's just this curved shaped area, so it fits nicely on the neck area. You can see I'm just used some nice sharp scissors, and there. I'm just going to go a little bit more down there just to give it a little bit more ease. So then when this turns through, you see, that opens out. Can you see how that just nicely opens out? And then it's going to shape nicely. But we're just going to show you how to turn through this corner. Now, there's a couple of ways you can do it. If this was really thick fabric and you felt like you needed to cut across there because it was too thick, you can, but on this instance we're not going to. And I've got my thumb, this is my left hand, I've got my thumb up into the corner there, and I'm turning it round the back on that edge of where the machining is, and then I'm going to fold down the top facing of that 1 centimetre, and I'm pinching it with my thumb and my finger at the same time. And when I push that through, my finger is pushing through, and it's going to come like that. You see, so you have a lovely cornered edge. You're folding it rather than pushing it, but you can do it whichever way is easier for you. But now we're going to do the understitching and show you how we understitch the neck. So we're now going to do the understitching on the underside of the facing, but before you do that, you just need to double check that these are marrying up nicely before we come to do our understitching. So that's where you need to tweak these top edges if they're not symmetrically marrying up. Okay, so here it's impossible for you to start understitching right from this edge because of the nature of the facing. So it's probably about, well, I'm going to say inches, but I would say that's about 1.5 inches. What would you say that's centimetres?
I'd say about 5 centimetres.
Okay,
from the centre.
all right. So we're going to start understitching from here. Now, because this is a curved, obviously the facing, I don't press this part, okay? I go straight into my understitching because you have more of a manoeuvre of pushing, bringing your fabric out with your fingers. So as you can see, I'm placing that underneath. Yeah, and the pin there is only to show you where I'm starting. And so because also where you snipped now you're facing, you have to make sure that this facing isn't going like this or going like this. It has to go towards the outer edge of your facing. It's going this way, okay? So put that underneath there, and you can feel it with your fingers if anything isn't quite where it should be. So I'm going to lower my needle in. Again, if you've switched your machine off and switching it back on again, put it on a length of stitch 3. So we're going to go forwards and backwards. And again, this is, can you see where I'm really working it with my fingers and especially my left fingers. I am right-handed, but my left fingers are just as strong as my right fingers. And I'm really pulling this apart. That's a beautiful match seam there, don't you think, Lisa?
Absolutely. So you're saying 3 millimeters, I would say, from the seam line, catching the seam allowance underneath. That's what gives the facing the weight to sit inside the neckline.
So we are using, this is a clear foot, just so you could see it in the video, hopefully. There. So can you see how I'm pulling this out as I'm machining it down? So I'm not working like this, I'm working like this, okay? And if you had been doing the continued facing for the skirt, the jump dress, sorry, you would have started from the other side, and you would be carrying all the way from the one side to this would be the last side you would be doing. You would be doing a continuous understitch from one side.
So from one hem.
Yes.
You start at one hem.
Yes.
And so all the way around, up around the neckline.
Yes.
Down to the other hem.
Yes.
And you're starting on the side that allows you to sew the facing on the right.
Yeah.
So you're sewing on the facing side.
That's it. That's it. There. So can you see? It's always working when you're doing understitching. You're always holding the fabric like that. Sometimes I might maneuver my hands, and it also depends on fabric as well. You know, this is a nice sturdy denim. It's soft, but it's sturdy. You might, with a more softer fabric, you might have to maneuver it slightly differently. So I'm then going to go a locking stitch, and then we finished our understitch. I'll bring it out so you can just see there.
So that's the one side of the neckline for the Jumpset version.
Yeah.
You would then go and repeat that on the other side for the Jumpset version.
And you would start from, I'll just show. So you would start from the bottom, working up to the top.
So we're just going to take a look at the bodice of this dress on the mannequin, because we're going to explain how to do something in the next stage that you can either do now or you can do it at a later point if you feel like it's happening. So on this dress, where the dresses, the bodices are crossing over each other, I've got a little bit of excess fabric here. It's almost about 1.5 centimeters, where I actually want the seams to join. I want that part of the bodice to sit there. So I'm going to lose 1.5 centimeters of fabric here. So when we cross over the bodices and we stitch them, preparing them to sew them into the skirt, we can actually take out that excess fabric at that point. Alternatively, you can sew your dress complete, you can fit it on, and if you notice that it is sort of bulky there and you have a little bit of excess fabric, you can go in and drop these down so that they sit at that point. So what we'll do is we'll go back to the denim version and we'll show you how to resolve that if it's happening to your dress. So at this point your facing is in and you've understitched and pressed it. Now with the wrong side of the fabric facing up, we're going to cross over the two bodices. And it's important that you mark where your center front points are. So those are notches. So just mark them with pins. So there's the center front and there's the center front. And what you would normally do is you would cross over the left over the right, as make sure that you've got the wrong side of the fabric facing up. And you would align the two center fronts. So all we're doing in this step is we are pinning the bodices together, and we're going to create a little stitch line across there. You can do it next to the overlocking stitch, just to hold these together so that when you sew it into the skirt, these don't move around. So there's a couple of options. You can stitch that with the raw edges all flush at this point. Then you can complete your dress or jump set and you can try it on and you can see whether you're happy with the fit here where the two bodices cross over each other. What we have noticed is that a few people like to drop down the bodice points a little bit more, which helps it to feel a little bit tighter across your front. On the pattern piece, it's easier to illustrate this. What we're doing is I'm only taking off 1.5, so I'm drawing 1.5 centimeters from this edge to there, and I'm just drawing that in a lovely shape to match up with this edge here. And so I will cut this off and this becomes the new raw edge. You might want to do more. I would say if you are unsure, it would be better to complete this section, try your dress on and then decide. But this may not seem like very much, but what it does is it just allows a little bit of a tighter fit at the bodice. So what I'm going to do is I'm still going to pin the center fronts together. And just make sure you're not catching the back fabric. And then if you are happy with the way it is, you will pin along here and you will stitch through all the layers. But if you do want to drop this down, there's that 1.5 I showed you on the paper. There. This becomes my new raw edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull that down to meet there. And underneath, this becomes your new, this is your raw edge here. So you could stitch that and then you could overlock that excess fabric off or just leave it as it is. It's up to you. So for the moment, we are gonna, for this tutorial, we're not gonna do that. I'm just gonna pin through all those layers. And then I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch through all the layers so that the bodices stay together. So depending on which version you're working on, whether it's the Jumpset or the dress, you will either have the trouser legs or the skirt with the wrong side facing up, and this is the center front and this is the center back, and they are your side seams. So you're going to put that in position and then you're going to take the bodice and you're going to turn it to the right side and you're going to turn it upside down so that you can see the waist seam there. And what we're going to do is we're going to open up the skirt and we're going to drop the bodice inside the skirt or trousers, depending on which version you're making. So I've put 2 pins in white. I know those are my center fronts. And then I know that the center back of the skirt is matching up with the center back of the bodice. Now, because I don't have a seam at the center back of the skirt, I've just put a pin in to mark the center back. If this was the trousers, you would have a seam there at the center back. So firstly, we're just going to drop that inside like that. And now you can start to align your seams. So I'm going to start here at the center back. I'm just going to make sure those raw edges are nice and flush. And I'm going to put the pin in there. Then I'm going to come across to the center front. Again, I'm just going to align the center fronts together. And then I'm going to come across to the side seam. So on the trouser, you will have the pocket sewn into the raw seam at the top here. So it will look a tiny bit differently, but you will still match your center, your side seams together. So make sure the seam allowances stay open, and they're open there, and you're going to align those together. And then you come across to your other side seam. Make sure they stay open. And you're going to align those together. And that is my little dog barking in the background, looking after us. So now you can see that in between the pins, the fabric's really flush. I don't have a lot of easing in this fabric. If you do have any easing, you can gently ease between the pins. But what you'll do now is you'll continue to pin around the raw edges, making sure the raw edges are flush, and you'll put pins in like that, which are going to help you to ease this in and sew this together. So work all the way around the circumference, and you are going to sew from one point to the end on a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. So when you come to put the elastic in your jumpsuit or dress, you are going to refer to the finished garment measurements for the size that you're making. But we just want to give you some tips. It might be that you've chosen to go up a size or down a size depending on your measurements. And when it comes to the elastic measurement, it's probably worth not assuming that your waist is the same size as the size you're making. So what I would suggest is start looking at the elastic cut length for the size being made. In this case, let's say we're doing the UK 10 and we're going to cut the elastic 75 centimeters. So what that means is that the elastic has got a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance in it. So it's taken off. So here's the finished elastic length, which is 72. So there's 3 centimeters difference there, which is when you join the elastic together, it's crossing over 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. So I would first, before you cut your elastic, check it on your waist. You want the elastic to feel quite snug. If it's too loose, the dress just isn't going to cinch in at your waist. So make sure that the elastic is feeling quite snug. Once you've sewn the elastic in, it's quite tricky to unpick the elastic again if you want to change it, but of course it is possible. So get your cut length, so not your finished length, you want your cut length. In this case, it's 75. We would also suggest using a really good quality elastic. This is quite a narrow elastic. You can go a little bit wider than this. I would say probably up to 1 centimeter, bearing in mind that the elastic is sewn into the seam allowance of the waist, which is 1.5 centimeters. So you can go up to, I'd say, 1 centimeters in width. But you want an elastic that's really good quality, because once you're stretching this around the waist of the dress, it will stretch even more. And if it's a poor quality elastic, it may just stretch out too much. So once you have your elastic cut length, you're going to cross over the 2 ends and you're going to stitch this 1.5 centimeters crossed over each other like that. You can do this on a sewing machine using a zigzag stitch or a triple elastic stitch on a sewing machine, or you can just sew it by hand if you're finding it tricky to sew on a sewing machine.